over to you, Derek. Thank you very much.
So thank you to that. Yeah, in fact, one of the reason why I was a few minutes after your appointed start time is because I've just hot-footed it here by way of some road diversions from the AGM of the Carnegie Dunfermline Trust. And I'm fortunate enough and honoured, in fact, to be, as one of the adjuncts to my councillor role, one of the council-appointed trustees, of which in every term there are three. And I'm sure you probably all know fine well who Andrew Carnegie is, but the Carnegie Dunfermline Trust was set up 100 years ago by the man himself in order to provide, firstly, a kind of a steward and owner for Pittencrieff Park in Dunfermline, and in addition to that, to put together a fund which has as its raison d'etre bringing sweetness and light to the good folk of Dunfermline.
Oh wow, that's lovely.
All the outside bodies you could possibly be attached to or appointed to as a councillor, this, I have to say, is the gold medal from my point of view. It's great, and the trust has been able to do a queen of good stuff. But it's interesting, I think, from the perspective of this group, that Carnegie himself, as one of Dunfermline's probably most notable and celebrated sons, second maybe only to Jim Leishman, and he was undoubtedly an internationalist. Clearly made his fortune in the States, but his abiding principles, apart from kind of wanting to educate people, was the pursuit of peace and the pursuit of friendship and amity between countries rather than enmity. And certainly latterly in his career, although it was steelworks that he made his fortune in, he was very insistent that none of that steel should be used to, for example, go towards making any of the munitions or the warships or the tanks or the World War. And he, as part of his philanthropy, funded the Peace Palace in the Netherlands. Wow. Spent an awful lot of his time in later life trying to influence governments and international organisations towards peace. Not with as much success as he would have liked, but certainly it remains part of his legacy. And I think, I guess you'll not be in floods of shock to discover that as an SNP councillor, I'm pro-Europe and was, I could say appalled or horrified, but actually really disappointed and upset by our exit from the European Union. Not necessarily because it is perfect or wonderful or necessarily as a panacea for kind of bringing all the countries of Europe together in all the ways that they might possibly be, but really because it seemed like, as you said, Joe, back at the start, to quote Mr. Rees-Mogg, an act of self-harm. It seemed that as a collection of countries, the UK had spent an awful lot of time as part of an organisation, and however willingly or reluctantly at times, contributing to the creation of something that was building bridges over those borders and was bringing together things that can best be done in collaboration, whether that is travel, freedom of movement, whether that is education and support for things like the betterment of our collective kids through things like Erasmus, whether it's even just the fundamentals of safety and standardization that we see through things like the CE mark and so on. It seemed to be such a pointless exercise to willingly remove yourself from that. Yeah. And I don't know, from the point of view of the role of a councillor, clearly there's an awful lot of the stuff to do with Brexit, both its implementation and its architecture, that are nothing to do with the role of councils or councillors. I think the press release that Steve Drummond, the chief executive of Fife Council, put out a couple of years ago in kind of noting what the council's response would be, the first line was, whilst Fife Council has no direct responsibility or influence over the UK government's policy on Brexit, and then went on to say kind of what steps we would take in the meantime with what resource and abilities we had. Still, it's something clearly that impacts everybody in some more obvious, some less obvious ways. And some of those are financial, some of those are practical in terms of the kind of the travel that we can or can't do. Some of them are emotional even. It just feels like as an island or set of islands, we've built another or put another obstacle in our way of working with others, which seems to me at least terribly unnecessary. But I guess where I was going with that was, although I'm an SNP representative, I think one of the things you kind of quickly both realise and adapt to is that as a councillor, it doesn't matter what party you're from or what stripe you happen to have been elected under. You're a councillor for everyone. Anyone who happens to be a resident in your ward is there for you to stand up for and represent in whatever way they need. And it's a weird dichotomy, particularly the week before election day, because no matter what possible sense of inflated ego that you have as a party candidate that says, oh, I've got a personal vote or not, as the case may be, it's the party banner that gets the vote. It's not you as an individual. So you kind of go out campaigning under a yellow or a red or a blue or an orange, and then it actually doesn't matter once you get in. You're there to do the best you can for the citizens of your patch and indeed collectively for the citizens across Fife. And so it's a real shame to be in a position where, as a council, we're either having to mitigate against some of the impacts of Brexit or indeed support people with other consequences that they've arrived at because of the decisions that have been made elsewhere by people that ultimately we have no control or power to either remove or influence. And when you sort of see the consequences, both for people from other EU countries who have obviously had sort of the upheaval of either choosing to attain settled status, for instance, who've had the worry and the upset of what impact it's going to have, not only on them personally, but on their work lives, their careers, their family, their partners, their kids, and so on, and their education. When you also see the impact it's had on Scottish residents who then have less in the way of rights to work overseas, business owners who now are choosing either to no longer trade in some extreme situations or who are facing barriers to trade that they didn't have previously. When you look at some of the kind of the fresh food providers, which obviously is a big chunk of both Scotland's brand and Scotland's export market, who now are often having to choose not to do business with some of their best customers because there's no practical way to get the goods in a timely fashion. Shellfish, lobsters, all these kind of things to market within 36 hours, then you've missed your opportunity. And when you see kind of the current reports, and there's data tracking the length of time that it takes trucks to get through the logjam at Dover at the moment. And I think the mean time in this last week for a truck to get through the queues was 76 hours, which
oh my gosh,
no use at all when you're trying to get anything fresh. And simply because of the scale of the problem, you've got no ability, never mind whether there's any willingness, there is just no ability on the part of government or civil service at Westminster even to be able to put something straightforward in place, like a kind of a two-lane system that says fresh food this way and non-perishables that way. There's no way of managing it, so they're not even going to begin that process. So there's no end in sight to that problem, and that's before you get to the issues you were talking about earlier, Joe, where some of the things are just continuing to be kicked down the line because they are completely in the too hard pile.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, in terms of my own experience as a councillor, I guess it's probably fair to say that there have been relatively few people who've come to me and said, I have a problem, it's a Brexit problem. But that's not to say that I haven't dealt with lots of Brexit problems, because so many of them are sort of second or third stage removed from the initial issue, which is then actually that people can't travel or farmers don't have the kind of the seasonal labour that they need. Even in the council, amongst the council's own workers, there have been huge challenges as a consequence. I think at the point where Brexit was being implemented 18 months, 2 years ago, there were 440 staff across Fife Council's own employees who were from one of the EU countries and needed to either make the decision or go through the process of attaining settled status. There have been a number of businesses, even in my own ward, who have gone out of business because the barriers now to doing the trade that they previously did are too high. And whilst clearly we will all get to and adapt to a new equilibrium, if you like, of how we cope with being outside of the EU, it seems that there's just an awful lot of things that were so much easier previously, even down to the very simple things that are becoming much more essential to just our daily functioning, particularly in the COVID times. So, for instance, as part of my day job, I ended up travelling over the last couple of weeks, and where 5 years ago, maybe even more recently than that, you would take your mobile phone with you when you were travelling, and the ability for it to connect seamlessly to one of the providers in one of the other EU countries would have been a nice to have in terms of just your basic communication. Now it's become much more important than that, because your phone is not just a way of contacting your family back at home or your office space. It's also your plane ticket. It's also your train ticket. It's also your payment method. It's also your hotel booking. It's everything. If you don't have it, I mean, it's bad enough if you've got it with you and it's out of charge, but if you can't connect, or you're being charged a fortune or whatever, then it's fundamental to our ability to just get around our neighbouring countries. And I could drop on for ages, and I'm sure I'm probably preaching to the choir here. So it may be better for us to get on to chat rather than just me hammering on. But I'm certainly delighted to be here and interested to see what is top of your list in terms of priorities, but also to see what, as a council or an individual councillor, but as a council as a whole, we could perhaps be focusing our attention on over the course of the next term, in order to try and either ameliorate or improve some of the issues that this group's identified.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was really interesting, quick overview. And thanks for the little extra bit on Carnegie at the beginning. That was very interesting. And I'm very glad to hear, although I'm at the other end of Fife, that the sweetness and light of people in Dunfermline is being looked after. That's good for you guys. The Wilkinson's up in the top corner there. I suffered the Dover bottleneck quite recently as well, taking a child to look at potential universities. And we've asked this question with various ministers recently that we've had on, like when Jenny Galruth was the Europe minister, and then Willie Rennie, our MP from MSP from this end, about, and it would be good for Fife, about rethinking Rosyth. And we were just hoping that maybe it might be something that the council might start to investigate a bit, and you know, if it was being promoted by the council and the Scottish government, and then they got some, I know there's this idea of it potentially might be a free port, but actually having the transport link again. I've lived in Belgium for the last 20 years, and when our kids were wee, we came every Christmas on that ferry, and I don't know how we'd have got here without the ferry, because it would not have fitted in a car. I'm quite sentimental about that ferry route, and I know even at Christmas it was often full of tourists who wanted to spend Christmas and New Year in Scotland. And when we came in the summer, the Dutch, the Germans, the Belgians, there were lots of people who loved the fact that they could get to Scotland and the north of England, and places where you can walk and cycle more easily than in the south of the UK. So I know there was a problem with not enough freight and so on, but I just wonder if it's ever come across the sort of screen of Fife Council to think about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in me personally, you've got a strong ally for that. I know that with it in his constituency. One of the most vocal of our local parliamentarians for that has been Douglas Chapman. Because he was a councillor for Rosyth, I think, before he got elected to Westminster. And so he's been pushing law on
You're frozen.
Derek, we're kind of losing you.
Oh, that's a shame. It seems fine at this end.
Oh yeah, no, you've come back. You've come back. Sorry. So the Rosyth option. It was which the MSP for.
Oh yeah, our local MP Douglas Chapman.
Oh, your MP. Yeah. Okay.
I was saying whilst I was glitching was he had of course been a councillor for Rosyth prior to being elected to Westminster in 2015, and he has been loud and vocal about wanting to improve a lot of Rosyth as a port. He's been actively talking to ferry companies about reinstating a ferry route there. Yeah, very much so. And obviously he's been pushing not so much for a free port, but for a green port, where
green port. That's the word. Yeah.
Well, there's again, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this, but there's a difference between the concept that Westminster's pushing out across the UK of a free port, where there's certainly to my eye, it looks like it's a kind of a way of creating a space where businesses can perhaps pay an awful lot less tax without necessarily attracting an awful lot of greater responsibility in exchange. And a green port, which is, I think, the Scottish Parliament's vision for it, where the focus is much more on how you smooth trade to make a beneficial impact on the environment, more than just on the pockets of the shareholders. And so I hope that it'll be a green port or a green free port that Rosyth ends up being. But I think there's plans in place, or at least consultation going on, to have 2 of those in Scotland. And Rosyth is very much being pushed as being one of those. I think it would be great if that could be the case, if we've got that here in Fife. So yeah, I think there's definitely support for that idea, both from our perspective at council and parliamentary level.
But if the council's producing anything in the way of leaflets, we run stalls every so often out on the street, and I'm sure it would be quite happy to, if you've got a proposal, to give that some public hearing.
Excellent.
And get some more support across Fife for it.
Brilliant. Well, I'll have a word with Douglas and see what material he's got that I could maybe pass on to you. And full disclosure, one of my very first jobs once I got to be a councillor in the by-election at the tail end of 2019 was that I got roped into being his election agent in the snap election that happened 6 weeks later. Okay,
yeah, that's good. Then you've got his ear. That's excellent. You can pass it on to us. So, has anyone other issues that they would like to raise immediately? Otherwise, one of the things that we're worried about is maintaining environmental standards within Scotland, given that the new Green Deal in Brussels is going to mean that there's ever more potential environmental legislation. I was watching a webinar on Tuesday with Paul McAlevey, who's a commission official, who's an ex-Scottish civil servant who I know from years back. And he was pointing out that SEPA does seem to be managing to sort of keep informal links with other European environment agencies. But, you know, fundamentally, we're not in the room anymore where the details of new legislation are being discussed. I used to work in the council secretariat in the Environment Working Party, and Beryl's a bit of an environment expert on the Scottish end here. And so it's something that we do discuss in the group quite often. And Scotland House obviously has Scottish officials out there, and the Scottish government officials that are here are going to be trying to keep on top of it. But, you know, if we're not implementing legislation, for local councils to be trying to keep up with doing what they would need to be doing if we were back in Europe all of a sudden, we feel is really important as well. And I don't know whether the Environment Committee of the Council's sort of given that much thought.
I completely agree with you. My daughter, who's a mad keen Hamilton fan, will have liked your reference to being in the room where it happens. And it's absolutely right. I mean, you need to be there to kind of continue to influence and understand where the direction of travel is for what will continue to need to be seismic changes in environmental legislation that need to be adopted and implemented quickly in order for all of us everywhere to meet the kind of the climate challenge targets. I guess from an SNP point of view, both at government level and at council level, again, very much on the same page. Clearly, as a party, our goal is to get back into the EU as soon as we can, as soon as we have the ability to. And that will be one of the top things on the agenda of an independent Scotland, to make that decision and request resumption of our membership. And so in the meantime, what we would seek to do is to make the distance we have to move as short as possible by maintaining Scotland's environmental standards, certainly in alignment with how they were when we left the EU, and ideally in step with any changes that the EU are introducing. But obviously the more time passes, the more of a challenge that is. But the Environment Committee at the Council is chaired by one of my colleagues, Councillor Ross Vitrano. He is, although he's I think the oldest of our group, he is also seeking re-election. And so I would certainly hope that the Environment Committee would continue to be led by and influenced strongly by the SNP's policies. And in our manifesto, which we launched this week, that was certainly one of the things that we've got a commitment to, which is to continue to maintain that. You know yourselves that we're obviously partnered up with the Greens at Holyrood, but I like to think that our own approach to the environment is as strong as theirs is, because ultimately the only reason we want an independent Scotland is so that we can improve it and make it better, and such a big part of the asset that we have, the land that we have, is its environment. And so I think all I can sort of summarise that as is to say I'm entirely in line with what you're hoping for there.
Good.
Yeah. Could I say, you do get the impression that scientists in general and the university sector, and certainly the NGO sector, are trying, in Scotland and in Britain as a whole, are really trying to keep in touch with their previous European colleagues. They seem to have established good links, and of course it's all informal and there's no financing and all the rest of it. And I suppose, Martin, the university sector is doing their best, because there were huge implications for the university sectors of coming out of Europe and losing all the research funding and all sorts of different things. There is the European Environment Bureau that you can sort of sign up to, and you can see what their actions are and what they're progressing, but it's nothing like the same as being in the EU itself, of course.
Absolutely.
No.
I mean, I think you're completely right. I think the principle we're operating on is behave as closely as you can to the way that you would if you were part of the club, because you want to be part of the club again. And whilst obviously, as you say, there are some areas where that's limited or restricted, I think the fact that across the whole of Scotland, in every single council area, the overwhelming view was that we wanted to be part of that. You're getting across a number of sectors where people are behaving as though we were still part of the club, because that's the desire. That's what the population.
Yeah. And it's things like the REACH, REACH, chemical stuff. That's an enormous loss for this country, and that's what's going to make it really difficult to keep up our standards on a par with Europe and other countries that are, other areas outside Europe which have high standards of regulation. And of course, in Britain, because we relied on the EU to deliver that and to do most of the work. I think I'm right, aren't I, Martin? I'm not sure. My husband isn't here, he would keep me right.
More of an expert on the chemical side,
yeah. But you know, we don't have the expertise here. Europe did all that, and we don't have the resources either nationally or at local authority level. You know, we don't have the number of technicians, we don't have the labs, the testing facilities. And although I think I get the impression that the UK is trying to do a sort of replacement REACH, it's nothing like as comprehensive or as extensive as what we've lost. And that affects everything, you know, from the treatment you use for cancer, you know, in radiotherapy, right down to the sort of ingredients in your washing up liquid. You know, it affects everything. So that's an underappreciated enormous loss that we've experienced. One of many, of course.
Absolutely. And I think also on top of that, I think there's an element of choice, I suppose, about kind of how you fund things across the piece as well, because I mean, it's not only that we've lost the connections with and the learning that we can do in partnership with so many of these different types of bodies, be it in the science world, be it in academia, be it in business and trade and commerce with Europe, but you've also lost the targeting of resources. So although clearly the UK paid an awful lot of money into the EU, we also got an awful lot back in the way of specific funding for areas that needed it. And they tended to be areas in the remoter parts of the UK. So there was an awful lot of funding in Northern Ireland, an awful lot of funding in Wales, an awful lot of funding in the north of England, a lot of funding for the Highlands and for some of the island communities, whether it was for roads or other infrastructure projects or whatever. And that being cut off at the source, all that, the consequential funding being retained at the Treasury, it's led to this weird situation where you've got the Chancellor being able to say, oh, I'm funding all these projects, here's our kind of levelling up fund or redevelopment funds and so on. But actually, it only amounts to about a fifth of what was previously being distributed under the EU banner. So in fact, essentially, each of those different areas within the UK, whether that's the devolved governments in Scotland or in Wales or Northern Ireland, or whether it is just regional authorities in sort of Merseyside or in the northeast of England, they're actually just have lost out on a whole bunch of money that is, you know, it's kind of the opposite of what we were promised on the big red bus.
Oh yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And Derek, you touched briefly as well on agriculture and agriculture workers. Oh, sorry, some dogs have just arrived in my house. And one of our recent monthly discussions involved Liz Smith, and she explained, one of our regional MSPs, she and Willie Rennie working together, Lib Dems and Conservative, to really try and push up the numbers of visas for workers to come back, because that was clearly a nightmare last summer, and already at the beginning of this year, polytunnels or plastic tunnels not going up and just not enough people around. And I don't know, I think they were working via the Parliament. I'm not sure, the council presumably can't do very much on that because the visas come centrally, is that right? Or are you pressurising the government as well?
No, I mean, I guess the council has dealt with sort of movement of people from several perspectives, some of it more recently, and obviously as a consequence of the conflicts in Afghanistan and now Ukraine, have been to do with people who are fleeing conflict or difficult situations, but in terms of the mechanism, it's the same ask is still, we need it to be easier for people to come into the parts of the country where we can either host them or they're needed for work. And right across the board, no matter who's asking, whether it's the SNP ministers at Holyrood or whether it's the joint administration, Labour and SNP from Fife House, you get nowhere. I mean, it is howling into the wind because the mindset from Westminster has been very much following on from the pattern that Theresa May set when she was in power of creating a hostile environment. I mean, that has been the objective, and it's clearly been achieved. It feels like a hostile environment. And I think the thing that really disappoints me is that not only has it created a hostile environment for people who might consider coming here, there's a knock-on effect in at least two directions. One is that it feels like a hostile environment to a lot of the people from elsewhere in Europe or indeed the world who are still here by choice. And I think by proxy makes it feel like a lot of us who are actually pro-Europe and pro-immigration are owning that hostile environment, even though we don't want to. On top of all of the practical consequences for many, many people, there's a kind of an emotional residue or baggage that comes with it for everyone, I think, who lives here.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yes, I mean, education is obviously an area where local government has a role to play. And I simply ask out of ignorance, I mean, are there further opportunities for promoting contacts between schools in Fife and elsewhere in Europe? I mean, is there funding available for that? No,
that's a really good question, which I'm probably not very well placed to fully or properly answer. As a principal, completely supportive. I think that would be a great idea. I know of some individual schools and head teachers who are taking that sort of opportunity and who are using some of the money from their pupil equity fund that they receive directly from the Scottish Government in order to do that sort of thing. Sometimes that's through increasing and promoting language skills. Sometimes it's through promoting and retaining the ability to make school trips, for example. I mean, I know that there are some of the schools in Fife part fund trips, for example, to go over to France and Belgium and use that to integrate with either the history or the modern studies curriculum to see some of the important sites that are associated with the First and Second World Wars. But I'm sure that there are many more opportunities than are able to be taken up in order to kind of build and foster those sorts of relationships. I mean, it would be really nice to kind of see a more organised partnering or twinning type relationship with some of the schools across Fife. I know some of them do take the opportunity to make contact with high schools, particularly in their twin towns, for example, from where Dunfermline's twinned with places in both Germany and in Norway, I think.
Yes, I mean, that would basically be the connection. I'd be looking into the twinning arrangements of different communities in Fife with parts of Europe. And really, the more we can involve young people in these exchanges, the better for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think, to extend your thought there, I think what that does is it creates potentially a new generation of folk who have an appreciation for other parts of Europe and therefore ideally will continue to want to work, collaborate and foster and rebuild links across Europe. You don't want to kind of have a lost generation who grew up with us outside of the EU and have no appreciation or understanding of its value.
Yeah, second that for sure. Paul's being very shy to say, but he's done a really good map for us all, because we now have a Dunfermline Euro Walk. The authors Martin Wilkinson there, and Paul authored the St Andrews Euro Walk, and these walks are we're trying to spread them out all across Scotland and eventually have a whole network. And the idea is to just something short with about 10 stops from different countries, different European neighbours, not necessarily all EU, but European. And they can be historical, they can be modern, it can be some local food store from Hungary or something, just to make people understand for how long and how current Scotland's links with the continent are.
Yeah,
and in doing that, Paul also did a fantastic map that we've been intending to and still haven't quite got around to doing, of Fife with all of the flags of all of the countries. And it's something that schools could use brilliantly. And maybe we can find the right person in the council to do this with. I've tried a bit and haven't really found anyone, but that we could prepare it as a school resource. And Paul's set it up so that you click, don't necessarily have the Fife name there, have the foreign names, and then the kids have to look at the map and work out now which town is that's twinned with that. And you click on the map on the flag of the country, and you find and it takes you to the Wikipedia page about the town that is the twin. And so it's a really fantastic tool, and it would be great if we can get somebody from the education department of the council to maybe take it up and promote it to schools. That
sounds magnificent. First I've heard of it, and blown away. That sounds like a really good project. I would be delighted to kind of promote it, share it, see it, learn more about it. I don't know how far you've gone in terms of exploring contacts, but immediately my first kind of couple of go-to people would be on the council officer side, probably Carrie Lindsay and her deputy Sheila. I think they would, if you haven't approached them already, would be very interested.
Okay, well, maybe I'll follow up with you afterwards.
And then, but yeah, there's definitely kind of hooks we can reach into, I think, to make that go somewhere. That sounds really good.
That would be great. And we've created a website called eurowalks.scot, which I'll send you the link to, which took it out of just being in the European Movement in Scotland website, so that it wasn't something political that some people shy away from, and we created a leaflet that's less political than our usual leaflets as well, which has a QR code, and people can find the maps and the stories. And the Dundee one we're hoping to open on the 7th of May, which has all sorts of interesting stories about Dundee. I didn't know that 2 polar bears were brought to Dundee and one escaped, and it was only caught because it staggered into a tailor's shop and caught sight of itself in a mirror, apparently. So they're fascinating stories, and Paul's found lots about St Andrews as well. So and Martin about Dunfermline. So would anybody else like to ask Derek anything else before we sort of begin to close up here? Anne or Martin or Alistair, anything? No? Okay, well, Derek, it's been really lovely having you along, and great to hear all of your positive responses to our concerns. And the more local politicians, at all the levels of representation that we meet, then the more people we've got to call on when we have stalls, or maybe people want to promote something. And it's been quite hard for, we used to have monthly meetings and we'd have over 30 people attending in person in Kirkcaldy. And sadly, the numbers coming to the Zoom calls have begun to dwindle a little bit, partly, I think, because of Zoom fatigue. And it's about time we got back into a face-to-face system. And also because we haven't been able to run stalls and see each other and do things together. And that's starting to come again. And in the interim, with all these Zoom meetings we've had, we have met a lot of people who do seem to really support our goals. So it won't just be a one evening stop. We will be back in touch with you, and it's really very nice to hear somebody being so supportive.
No, I'm delighted to have been asked along. It was really nice to meet you all. Absolutely happy to keep in touch and support any of your efforts in general, but specifically your MAPS project sounds like a real one that the council could and schools could get their teeth into and help to scale up in support of your efforts.
Great, because Jenny Gilruth also said, I want one for Glenrothes too. So we haven't quite finished with the Eurowalks yet. And there's the Fife4Europe tour, more for doing on bikes and by car and things. So we can let the council have that too. Yeah. That would be great. So thank you very much, Derek. It was very good of you to come along. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, and all the best next week.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Right. Bye. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.